Hi, this is Alfred Petraka, and I'm in Micro Unit 5, the role of government. And two of the most important concepts to understand in the role of government unit is the difference between positive externalities and negative externalities. And what the government does, these are actually market failures that, for instance, in the case of positive externalities, many people benefit, many third parties that are not involved in the transaction benefit from positive externalities. There's a big difference between, see these two if you look at the graph above, you see the first curve is the marginal private benefit. And that's actually the demand that private entities would demand if the market was left alone to its own devices. Okay, that would be that marginal private benefit. Now, in the upward sloping curve is the marginal social cost. That is the incremental social cost of producing such a good, this positive externality. Now, what happens is the market left to its own devices only produces where marginal private benefit meets marginal social cost at Q0 up above. That Q0 will be the equivalent to the quantity that the private economy would produce if it was left to its own devices. And this, of course, is not the optimum level that we want produced for society's good. So, for instance, the greatest positive externality of all is education. What does the government do to make education demanded as much as it should be in light of the marginal social benefits that third parties receive from an education? Just to let me give you an example of what third parties receive. For instance, let's say your school system in your local town was considered a good school system. Well, there are people that don't have children in the school. There are adults that don't have children at Medway High School that would benefit from the school system being good because there would be much more demand for real estate, just as one example. For instance, people with families would not mind coming to Medway because their school system has a good reputation. If the school system had a poor reputation, then people with children would not want to move to Medway, therefore decreasing the demand for real estate in Medway, and therefore hurting the real estate values of not only the people with children in Medway, but the people that don't have any children going to the Medway school system. So there's a big third-party benefit, and that's just one element of it, right? In other words, education benefits all of society in that those students are going to go into the workforce and produce much better quality goods in the private economy, right, than they otherwise would if they weren't as educated. So there's all kinds of third-party benefits to education. What happens here is, in effect, positive externalities are under-demanded by society because these third parties who benefit don't realize that they're benefiting in the way they do. So they don't tend to demand as much of a positive externality as they should if you're talking about the optimum level of that positive externality being produced. Now, what government does to change this, government will step in and subsidize positive externalities. So, for instance, let's just take one example. Let's say we have subsidized lunches, right? Well, a lot of third parties benefit from subsidized lunches because this gives students good nutrition, which enables them to learn and then enables them to be much more beneficial to society than if they went into school with a lack of nutrition and they weren't able to learn. So the third-party benefits of that, right? The third-party benefits of education, as we already said. Well, because positive externalities are under-demanded, what happens is they are underpriced and underproduced. Just picture the demand being lower than it should be at MPB. Now the government steps in and subsidizes. So it subsidizes education. If you think of like Pell Grants, for instance. Pell Grants subsidize the education of low-income students and other students. So what happens is the marginal social benefit is factored in by government. They subsidize, and now you get the demand going to the right, where the marginal social benefits are considered by the size of that subsidy. And what happens is the demand goes up for the positive externality. Now, what does that do? That increases the quantity to Q1 in this diagram. Q1 is the socially optimal quantity that society needs to have to optimize the use of this positive externality. Now, it also raises the price from P0 to P1, and that P1 price, that higher price, is the socially optimal price, the value we should put on this positive externality when the third-party benefits are considered. This new triangle, this bluish triangle that I'm tracing over here with the cursor, that's called the potential welfare gain. This is the welfare gain from government subsidizing positive externalities. Now, there are other ways to subsidize positive externalities. For instance, if you look at alternative energies, what the government does many times is they subsidize the producer rather than the consumer. So when they subsidize the producer, that would actually be the MSC to the right here, actually being shifted to the right. And for instance, let's say the government is subsidizing the production of solar panels, a per unit subsidy. Well, that would take the MSC and drive that MSC down, therefore causing more solar panels to be produced. So the quantity would go up. But in that case, subsidizing the producer would actually also lower the price of the solar panels. But the diagram we have here is more of an example of a consumer-based subsidy, much like the GI Bill of Rights or Pell Grants, that the subsidy is given to the consumer, and then the consumer chooses how they spend that subsidy. So therefore, you'd be raising the demand, the MPB shifting to the right to MSB. So that's how the government affects the quantity and price of positive externalities. Now, negative externalities. Let's go to the next graph. Here's the marginal private cost. You see that curve here, and I'm putting my cursor on it. The marginal private cost, when the economy is left to its own devices, would be right here. The supply of the good would be right there. The marginal private benefit equals the marginal social benefit in this example. So that's the negative sloping curve. The MPB or the MSB is sloping downward to the right. Now, the government in this case, the market left to its own devices, the market failure here is actually to provide too much of the negative externality, more than is actually good for society or optimizes the use of this good for society. Now, what's an example of a negative externality? For instance, pollution is a negative externality. Okay, let's say we have a firm and they're dumping waste into a river, toxic waste. Okay, now they're getting away with taking their costs for making this product and dumping it onto third parties. Now, when they do that, what happens is it makes their costs lower than they otherwise should be because they're not incurring the cost that they're dumping onto the third parties. So the government, therefore, for this to be the optimal level, to move it from Q1, which is what the private market would do, is produce a Q1, and to make it go back to the socially optimal level of Q2, as it is in this diagram to the left of it, the government would have to take some action to internalize the cost back to the private firm, back to the firm that's involved in the transaction. Remember, when I say third parties, there's the producer of the good and the consumer of the good. They're the initial people involved in the transaction. When I talk about third parties, I'm talking about that third parties that are downriver from this firm that are getting those wastes dumped on their doorstep. And therefore, somebody has to clean that up, right? And it's being incurred by these third parties, which, we all say is unfair, that they're incurring the costs of the other private entity. So what happens is the government will step in, they will fine the firm, they will make the firm pay for the cleanup of the waste that they dump in the river. They will tax the firm for the cost that they're dumping onto the third parties and somehow make the third parties whole again and not being having to live with that cost themselves. Or they could actually take the firms to court. If you think of something like the tobacco court cases that the states filed and got huge settlements from the tobacco companies, that would be an example of doing it through the legal system, of dumping those costs back onto the tobacco companies that they were getting away dumping onto the rest of the economy. So what would happen is if you tax or fine or sue. Okay, that would take this marginal private cost curve. Now the marginal social costs are incorporated into the cost. It's internalized back to the private firms who produce this good. And when they do that through the three processes we just talked about, now you would move that curve to the left. There'd be less of this good produced. So if you're talking about whatever product they're making, let's say it's widgets, that if they're producing widgets and they're getting a dump waste into the river, then the government could fine that company or make that company pay for cleanup, thereby taking the social costs and internalizing them back to the firm. Okay, and when they do that and the cost of producing the product gets higher for the firm as we deem it fair to be because of them dumping it on the third parties, now the marginal social cost, when that's considered, now you move it to the left and you see the marginal private cost shifts left to the marginal social cost. And now you have this new equilibrium, the socially optimal quantity of Q2 and the socially optimal price of P1, right? The price of that product goes further. Initially, the price, when it's just the marginal private cost considered, the price would be down here, that imaginary line I'm making. Let's say that's P0 if you want, or P private. That price would be where I'm putting the cursor, down here somewhere. Well, now because of the shift to the left with the marginal social cost considered, now the price would go up and the quantity would go to that socially optimal quantity of Q2. So as you can see, to get to the optimal level for this negative externality, the government has to step in and internalize the cost back to the private firm so that they will incur the cost rather than the rest of society who doesn't benefit from the sale of this good. So that's my synopsis of the difference between a positive externality and a negative externality. And the one more thing I'd like to mention is this triangle, the shaded triangle, is actually the deadweight loss. The deadweight, and you see it marked so down below, deadweight loss of economic welfare. And that's what will happen once the government internalizes this cost back to firm. Thank you very much. This thing?
Yeah. And stop. Click stop.
Oh.